Buddy. Um, Good night to you folks in the U.S. as always. Hey, Sharon, can you make me a coffee? Take your time. So we are live, ready to rock, and today we are talking about offshore formations. Ooh, the mosquitoes are crazy today. Offshore formations, right? So what is the point of an offshore corporate formation? There are multiple reasons you might want to have an offshore corporate formation set up, right? The first reason is typically corporate taxes, right? So, corporate taxation. There are corporate structures that exist in the world for the sole purpose of having a better, Jesus, having a better tax rate for your corporation, right? These structures are typically considered to be international business corporations, right? IBCs, or some countries like Mauritius will call them global business corporations or GBCs. Okay. Typically, the one thing that's the same in all of these corporation types, right, or corporate formation types, I should say, is that within those structures, you don't have to pay as much or possibly any taxes, all right, for having that structure. Wow, mosquitoes are really trying to eat me alive today. All right, so what does that mean? We'll start with Seychelles, give you a solid example. Seychelles uses IBCs, right? So they have international business corporations. An international business corporation under the Seychelles rules cannot do business in Seychelles at all. Okay, so it's a formation that's designed for you to not do business in that country. You're supposed to form in that country and do business somewhere else. If you do business in that country, you will have to pay that country's corporate tax rates. Okay, so no business being done in country. And they have definitions. Remember, we talked about plenty of times, just because you know what a word means does not mean that you know the legal definition of that word in every country in the world, right? So for us, and when I say us, I mean people who do business in America. If we're processing business in America, we're doing business in America. We're working in America. If we're offering the services in America, but we're processing the business elsewhere, we're working in America, right? So the definitions of what it is to work for like American companies are very different than it might be for companies in other countries. So these IBCs are specifically designed for corporate work to happen outside of the country, but then they have to define what work is, right? Because if the corporation exists in the country, if it was America, no matter what you did, it would be work with, under the American lexicon. So the definitions have to be in line with what they're trying to accomplish as a country. So you can process business in the country, no problem. That's not considered work for their definitions under their lexicon. The work has to be delivering whatever the product or the service is, right? So it's the delivering that's going to make it work for them, right? Not the transaction and the transfers, right? So for example, we have had companies where the last one was actually a hotel, a boutique hotel. So the hotel's booking agency is an offshore company in the Seychelles. All international bookings go through the booking agency. Under the Seychelles definition, that is not work. That's an IBC, and all the bookings are coming in from abroad, right? You're not doing any physical work in the Seychelles whatsoever. So the tax rate for all of those bookings is 0%. Okay, so you pay 0% corporate taxes on all of those bookings. Now, any local bookings, because of the country where the hotel is actually situated, any local bookings can't go through that, or else it would trigger a problem, right? So you have to understand both the laws in the country where you're operating and which IBC or GBC you're using and how that works, right? So for that particular country where the hotel is actually located, if a local person were to book with the offshore booking company, it wouldn't matter because they're local. So it would still count as in-country booking, and you would still have to pay the taxes to that country on that booking. So any local people who are booking, they book through a management company instead of the booking company, and then you pay your taxes on that and whatever, right? But because it's an internationally focused hotel, they're still saving 80 to 90% of what they would have paid in taxes by running it through the offshore booking company in the country that has a 0% tax rate. You following me so far? Making sense to all you guys, right? Throw a one in the chat if you're following me so far and that makes sense. All right, solid. Okay, so that is the tax reason that some people would set up their offshore companies. Another reason would be for quasi asset protection, and really it's growth protection, right? So when you have full on asset protection, the best way to do that is always typically with a trust, right? But assets don't always translate into income, right? They might have a value, but they don't always translate into income. So your income generating structures are typically companies, right? Now, all corporations are companies. Not all companies are corporations. Okay, so your income generating asset is typically a company and or a business, right? Once you have assets, your asset protection formation or your asset protecting structure is typically a trust. So if you have things that need to be protected, that's what a trust is for. If you need to make money off of things, that's what a company is for. Okay. You can have a business that is not a company. It's the worst type of business structure, but it does exist. So you could say business to cover the full gambit. But money comes from businesses. Assets are protected in trusts. Okay. Trusts should not be generating income and that be the source of your income. Trusts grow income, right? You can have securities in a trust that are compounding over time, and so the trust is growing your principal investment, right? So trusts manage investments, right? But if you're generating funds, that should be done through a business. The business is the formation and the entity that's designed to do that thing. Trusts are typically taxed at a much higher tax rate than both people and businesses because they're not designed to take the place of a business. So all the folks that are running their businesses through trusts and all the yahoos on social media telling people to run their businesses directly through trusts just really have no idea what they're talking about, right? So the trust should protect your assets, and those assets could include your stocks and your bonds and investments, right? And those things can keep growing inside the trust. That's fine, right? But trusts are typically designed to protect your assets. You can have special purpose trusts, right? We specialize in special purpose trusts, specifically generational wealth trusts, right? But that trust still holds a small asset and protects it while it compounds. That's the purpose of a trust, protection, especially offshore trusts, right? So that's the difference. Companies are designed to make money, right? And they don't have the same kind of restrictive tax regime that trust has for holding money. So if it's an active situation where you're making money off of something, then the proper formation 9 times out of 10 is a business formation, right? Not a trust formation. Can the trust own the business? Yes, right? Because what is the trust actually doing in that situation? It's actually owning the shares of the business, whatever those shares happen to be. They might be membership units, they might be stock certificates, whatever the shares of equity happen to be, the trust is owning the equity, which is an asset. And by owning that equity, it protects it, okay, which is the purpose of a trust, right? A lot of people confuse limited liability protection and think that their interests are protected by the company's limited liability. That's not true. Your interests are completely exposed and are not protected by the company's limited liability, right? So make sure that you're dealing with someone who's like explaining how things really work, so that you're not under the assumption that you're covered when you're not, right? How does that work? What's a real life example of that? Let's say that like right now in Pennsylvania, or yesterday in Pennsylvania, it was snowing, right? So the roads are bad, it's slushy, all of that stuff. Let's say you're driving, you got to drive somewhere, you got to drive to the store, you didn't get the eggs or the milk or the whatever, you got to go get something. While you're out, you end up in a fender bender. Okay, standard thing, it happens. Now your insurance doesn't cover the damage, right? So the insurance pays out whatever's in your policy, $200,000, $500,000, but the damage with the medical bills, it's $5 million, right? So there's more money that you're now liable for because of this auto accident. Okay. Now your company had nothing to do with the auto accident. You own a company. Company does all right. Company has limited liability, right? Doesn't matter whether it's an LLC or not, has limited liability. Okay, that's great. That limited liability does not extend to the protection of your shares in the company. You own the shares directly, and they are not covered under limited liability. So the judge can literally take your stock in your own company and give it to the person that you hit in the auto accident. It's not protected. You don't have limited liability for your personal assets. Your company has limited liability, right? So it almost would have been better had you been in a company vehicle doing company work and got in the car accident, and then the company be on the hook in that situation, because you just lost the entire company instead of having a judgment against the company that needed to be paid off, right? And so people that don't understand how limited liability actually works both ways think that because the company has limited liability, the company is completely and utterly protected, when in truth, you're the weak link. If something happens with you, and it doesn't even have to be your fault, right? Especially if you got an American business and you live in America, right? Because, for example, in America, if it snows and there's ice, on your front steps, and you don't clear that ice in a certain amount of time, where I used to live, it was 24 hours. That ice isn't cleared in 24 hours if somebody slips and falls on the public sidewalk, but in front of your house where the ice has fallen. So the public sidewalk. So under any normal circumstances, you can't tell somebody, this is my property, get off my property. That's a public sidewalk. But when it snows, if you don't clean that public sidewalk within 24 hours and somebody slips in front of your house, your homeowner's insurance is on the line for that. Right? So that could be something that had nothing to do with you. What if you're on vacation? You weren't there when it snowed, but somebody slipped, they fell in front of your house on the public sidewalk, right? And in a litigious country like the United States, they have the right to come after you for that, even though it's not your property, right? So under any other circumstances anyway, it's not your property. But there are rules set up like that. So now what happens? What if your homeowner's insurance can't cover the damages that they're saying happened? Right? And they win that judgment. Your homeowner's insurance is like, nope, we only pay out $1 million. That's what's in your policy. They got a $5 million claim. You're on the hook for $4 million more dollars. Right? So what are they going to start looking for? What are your assets? Oh, we see they have an LLC. It's a single member LLC. We can take all the membership units of the LLC, which is the LLC's version of shares. Just take them all and take the business. Is the business making money? Let's look. Let's do discovery. See if the business is making money. Business is making $800,000 a year. Awesome. Just take the whole business. Boom. Gone. right? Because you didn't understand how limited liability works in both ways. You're the weak link of limited liability, okay? Especially if you're a solo owner. So that's where things like, all right, well, the trust owns the company makes sense. Because if the trust owns the company and maybe you're the beneficiary of the trust, now you're in a situation where when those types of things do happen, and those are accidents, all those things I just talked about were accidents. Those aren't things that like you chose to do or you made an action and now you have to pay for the action that that you caused and it's your responsibility. Some of that stuff is made up responsibility, like the public sidewalk thing. That's made up responsibility. That's just something that the city government or the state government impressed upon you, depending on where you lived, right? So there are plenty of ways, especially in highly litigious societies like the United States, for people to be able to essentially sue you over things that aren't necessarily your responsibility. So your company would be exposed in those situations. The shares of your company would be exposed in those situations unless they're locked in some other kind of entity. All right, you guys following that so far? That's great. Okay. All right. So again, another reason for the offshore formation might be so that the formation is in a less litigious society. There are certain societies where suing is not the norm, right? There are certain countries where in order to bring a lawsuit, you have to put up a bond, especially if you're a foreigner, right? So, and those countries, typically know what they're doing, right? You got countries like the Cook Islands. The Cook Islands does that quite well. Nevis also does that quite well. Where if you're trying to bring a foreign judgment, right, and file it in that local court, you got to put up $1 million to even have the judge hear the case. You ain't got the $1 million, then you can't even start the process. Right. So it gets rid of foolishness and nonsense lawsuits. And they do that on purpose. And because they do that on purpose, their jurisdictions are very, very expensive to put trusts in because they know they're creating situations that benefit the people who have those offshore trusts. And so that becomes part of the business of the country. Grand Cayman Island used to be one of those countries. It still kind of is, but they're not at the tip of the spear anymore. They used to be right at the tippy top of the spear. Probably now, probably the Cook Islands is at the tip of the spear, but they know it. They know it, so it's expensive. We wouldn't put a trust in the Cook Islands if the person had less than 50 million in assets. Not $50 million in their pocket, 50 million in assets, right? So if you have a business that's more than a generation old, 50 million in assets might not be very much, right? So if you have a second generation business, your dad was a trash truck driver, built a business up, has 30 trash trucks, 40 accounts across the city, and now it's second generation. You added 25 more trash trucks, you got 1,000 employees. You add up, all of your assets, all the trucks you have, the machine shops, because you're doing maintenance on your trucks at that point, probably the locations that you have, the dumps that you add all that up, you probably got 50 million in assets. So it's not about, and the owners are probably making, just under or just about six figures a year. It's not like they're making millions. You know what I mean? They got 1,000 employees. So people hear numbers and they think that those numbers are extraordinary until they actually get a peek behind the curtain and understand how business works. And then they realize like, oh, wait a minute, maybe if you sold everything, you sold the entire company piece by piece, you might be able to liquidate, 50 million out of it. But as you're operating, there's no 50 million floating around. But if you're protecting all of these assets in an offshore trust, in a specialized country like Cook Islands or Nevis, where it's going to be expensive to do that, then it has to be worth your while. So there has to be a certain amount of assets that you would be putting into that trust, and the number has to make sense. All right. Yes, that is true. I appreciate that. That's probably why I'm a little bit out of it. I'm a little slower today than normal, but yeah. The funeral was last night. You must follow me on my Facebook. But yeah, the funeral was last night. Thank you for that. I appreciate it. But yeah, life goes on for the living, right? Thank you though. I appreciate that. I'm always surprised of how much you guys actually like follow me, not just not just the company pages. But thank you. I appreciate that. No, actually, no, I wouldn't. Okay, for the other two lives. So what they asked was, so with so you'd have all those trash trucks in the trust to protect the asset. No, you have the company owned by the trust to protect the asset, right? Because you don't want the trash truck to get into a car accident like we were just talking about, and your entire trust is exposed because of a single car accident. That's not what you want, right? So you want the trash truck gets into a car accident, and then the company's insurance policy kicks in, and then there's an umbrella policy that kicks in if the amount goes above what the insurance policy is talking about, and then beyond that there's a judgment against the company, right? But it never actually gets to the trust itself, right? That's what you want. You don't want litigious items in a trust. That's the number one problem that I see, especially on like these social media apps where people who have no idea what they're talking about are making videos about things like this. The number one thing that I hear in those, quite frankly, bullshit videos is, I have this structure the same way the rich people do it, and my cars and my house are owned by the trust. As soon as they say their cars and even their house is owned by a trust, they're full of shit. Somebody slips down your step, if someone breaks into your house and you don't have a railing on the steps, and when they walk down your steps they slip and fall, if a railing is part of your like city code and your house is old and you just don't have a railing on your steps, or you took it down, or the kids broke it, you just never replace it because it's your house, they can sue you for not having a railing in your house and your house not being up to code, which caused their accident while they were robbing you. Right? So when you're dealing with litigious country, like when we say litigious countries, like we're not exaggerating. In the United States of America, they can break into your house to rob you, possibly even at gunpoint, fall down the steps, and if there was no railing on the steps, and that was a requirement of the building code, they can sue you while they had no right to be in your house in the first damn place, and while they were there in furtherance of a criminal activity. Right? So houses are litigious, cars are litigious. We don't put litigious things in trusts. You don't want the freaking robber who tried to rob your house, who fell down the steps and broke his leg, to have access to your trust because the trust owns the house, right? If it's an asset protection trust, right? There are trusts that don't really own anything and it doesn't matter, right? So like land trusts are sometimes set up in a certain way where it doesn't matter. That's a specialized trust. But typically, when people are talking about offshore trusts, they're either talking about generational wealth or asset protection. And in neither one of those situations would you want that trust to own a home or a car, right? So anyone who's saying that is just full of it. All right, but I hear that all the time, like literally all the time. I guess because I talk about trusts are in my algorithm, so I see all the bullshitters all the time. All right, so anything litigious, anything that's very easy to get sued over, should not be in there. Really, trusts should be the holding evolution of like a holding company, right? So your holding company might be a company that's sitting there and it's taking in, dividends from the shares it holds. That's what it should hold. It should hold shares. It might hold physical equipment and then rent that equipment out in like a rental agreement, depending on what the operating company is. But the way that the holding company is designed is going to be based on the way the operating company is designed. So if the operating company is a landscaping company, then maybe the holding company might have like some landscaping tools that it rents to. So there's a rental agreement, with the operating company. That's about the most work that a holding company should ever be doing. It really shouldn't be doing any work at all. But that's about the most work that any holding company should do, because it's only doing work with you. It's only really doing work with your operating company. So you could obviously choose not to sue your holding company, right? But anytime a company is doing work, it's opened up to lawsuit. Right? If you're doing something, then somebody could decide that you did that thing negligently, and in the negligent doing of that thing, you cause damages. And so now we're coming, for the damages that happened after the negligence, right? So that's like the most basic, progression of standing. And standing is like your right to sue somebody, right? It's different than criminal law. Like we're not talking about that, but standing is your right to essentially sue somebody under civil law, right? So that's like the most basic progression. You did something, and the thing you did was negligent, and that negligence resulted in damages. And now I need to be made whole from the damages. And because I have damages, that is the right that I have, the standing that I have to sue you, right? So if you have a formation that's not doing anything, then where does the standing come from? Right? So that's the reason why holding companies and really trusts don't do anything, because when they do things, it opens them up to liability. Even good things, right? Even good things, it opens them up to liability. So if you hand out free turkeys for Thanksgiving from your trust, and somebody gets sick from a turkey, trust is now open to liability. Right? If somebody's coming to get a turkey from you and they cross the street and they're not looking at where they're going, and they get hit by a car, they can stretch and say that they have standing to sue you, and that's going to have to be figured out in a court. Right? So doing things is how you create liability. So those protective structures should not be doing anything. They should just be holding things. Right? They should just holding equity in things, holding royalty agreements, possibly, holding even debt. They can even be holding bonds, right? But they shouldn't be doing anything. Make sense? Good, 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 good. All right, so moving along. If you got any questions, let me give a slight pause and break for questions. Really? That's interesting. I can't hear that. Do I seem off today? Well, that's interesting. Yeah. Yeah, no, yeah. Yeah, no, I mean, if you want to, if you want to see it, there's like a YouTube of it from the church that did the funeral. Again, thanks for the concern. I'm sure I probably am a little whatever, but yeah, I don't know. I don't notice it. But thanks for bringing it up. And I'm sorry if I'm like off. If I'm not flowing like I normally do, I apologize for that. All right, no questions on that so far. Okay, excellent. All right. Yeah. All right. So Taxation with offshore stuff really boils down to whether or not you can touch it, right? So it really boils down to whether or not you can touch it, especially with the trust. So with the trust, most offshore trusts are considered to be grantor by default. If they're grantor, that means that you have to do IRS filings if you're an American, right? In other countries, there might be something similar to grantor, and there might be some kind of filing requirement that you might have, for having the ability to access the funds in the trust is essentially what it is, or having any control over what happens, within the trust. Typically, when we're doing generational wealth, those trusts are non-grantor. Okay, they're legitimately non-grantor. That means that you have no control over the trust after you make it, right? So the control that is maintained is the fact that you were the one who wrote the trust deed. The trust deed is the law of the trust. All right, nothing can happen in that trust that is not in the trust deed. Right, so that's the control that you'll exercise into perpetuity. You're the one who wrote the trust deed. The trust only does what you want it to do forever. Okay, that's how the trust deed works. Beyond that, though, the day-to-day administration and all of that would be done by the trustee company. Okay, and that company is typically filled with lawyers, right? So the trustee company would analyze the trust deed itself and would do whatever the trust deed said that it can do in the furtherance of the trust and in the furtherance of the beneficiaries. The beneficiaries are typically your children or your grandchildren or your nieces or your nephews or your whatever, in a generational wealth trust. It's the next generation, whatever that generation may be. Okay, so that's typically how that's set up, and that's why it can be non-grantor, because you truly can't touch it, and we don't put U.S. assets in it, right? You put U.S. assets in a foreign trust, it becomes grantor again, right? Or you have to do a filing and declare the asset going into the trust and all that shit. If it's non-grantor, a legitimate non-grantor trust, no one has to file anything with the IRS legally until there's a distribution to a U.S. Citizen, or a U.S. asset is granted into the trust, right? Which neither one of those things. Well, the first thing will happen eventually, but will never typically put a U.S. asset in a generational wealth trust, right? Eventually, the kids or the grandkids are going to get distributions, and they may be U.S. citizens when that happens, and so they deal with that when it happens. All right, but you don't have to deal with that at all. Can you do a grantor trust? Yes. Some people opt for it. So if you do a grantor trust, now you can be the trustee of that trust, and you would have to do all your filings and declare where the bank accounts are to the U.S. government if you're American and all of that stuff. But for some people that makes sense. For some people that's the point, right? So there's something called a intentionally defective offshore grantor trust. Intentionally defective, right? So in an intentionally defective offshore grantor trust, it's an offshore trust. It's grantor, so you're reporting it to the U.S. government. But what it's allowing you to do is it's allowing you to take money away from your estate, right? Because that money that's in your estate, and this is for people who got money, right? But that money that's in your estate is going to be taxed at like 40%. So the intentionally defective offshore grantors trust allows you to remove that money from your estate. You still pay taxes on it. It doesn't get rid of the taxes, but you pay taxes at a much lower rate, like 14%. And you remove the money from your estate and you filter it through the intentionally defective, right, offshore grantor trust. And so that's an advanced strategy for folks who got quite a few dollars, and they're trying to ensure that it doesn't get eaten up in the estate process when they pass on. So that's one of the tools that's used. So yeah, you can intentionally have a grantor trust. You can intentionally have a grantor trust that's defective, that still assists your estate in certain things. So yeah, you could do both. No, I mean I wouldn't recommend that setup unless you got real money. Yeah, you need to have real money to be worried about an intentionally defective offshore grantor trust. Because if you're a state, you know, first of all, you get a free gift, and the free gift, what is it now? Is it $14 million? You get a free lifetime gift. Just go to irs.gov and lifetime free gift or whatever, and see what it is. It's a lot. Right? So you first have to be over the amount of your lifetime free gift to even consider an intentionally defective offshore grantor trust, because it's only the money above your lifetime givings, that you're worried about. That's the money that's going to be taxed at 40%. So if you ain't got the however many $1 million, a double digit $1 million, that's your everybody, doesn't matter how rich you are, it's an IRS thing. Everybody's lifetime free gift is double digit millions. If you ain't hit them double digit millions, ain't no sense in doing that offshore grant or trust. Yeah, not everything makes sense for everybody. Yeah, good question though. I mean, definitely a good question. I'm sure other people were thinking about it. I am really out here killing these mosquitoes, huh? I guess mosquito season is starting. I guess that's a good question. No, I've never met anyone who had malaria. I've never gotten malaria. I don't, not it's not a concern. I know a lot of y'all traveling here. You hear all the weird things. That's a great question, especially since I'm here clapping mosquitoes all over the place today. But no, I asked the question too, though. So like, don't feel like your question's like ridiculous or dumb or anything. I asked the question when I first got here as well. The answer that the doctor gave me was that most people have these sympathetic infections that allow them to naturally get like the antibodies. So it's not like he was saying that he was with what is it called? Not Greenpeace, like the Doctors International thing, and he was in the Philippines, and like they get chronic infections. So I guess it depends on the mosquito, but most of the people here they get these little, almost asymptomatic infections that allow their body to build up the antibodies. So no, malaria not a big thing. Other thing is there's a medicine, an anti-malaria medicine called quinine, and it is the active ingredient in tonic. And I always used to drink tonic, without the gin, mind you. But tonic was something I used to drink to as a tonic to settle my stomach. I used to, drink it almost like fruit salts. And I found out later that there's an anti-malarial medication in all tonic. That's the active ingredient in all the soda tonic. It's called quinine. So interesting. All right. Yeah. Right. So it, yeah, I mean, I'm not going to go too deep into it because you need so much money to make it effective, right? It was just the answer to that question of is it possible? Yes, it's impossible. It is possible. And it's called an intentionally defective offshore grantor trust. I bet you probably don't need one. Which trust do we recommend for everybody? Okay, so for everybody, we typically recommend just a generational wealth trust, because a generational wealth trust just compounds without you. It's like a set it and forget it type of trust. So it's an offshore trust. You would set your kids or your grandkids as a beneficiary. You would not be the trustee. You would not be the enforcer. You would not be the any of that. And then that trust would compound whatever the starting number inside of it was. and it would compound it for however many years you needed it to compound to get to whatever number you wanted. And then it would give access to your beneficiaries, whether those are your kids. Some people do generational wealth, but the next generation are actually orphans. So like whatever, right? But whoever you say the beneficiary should be, they get that money over time, right? So, and that money can grow relatively quickly. You'll never outwork money. Compounding is always going to do better than you over the course of your life. So you're never going to outwork money. But though that's the type of trust that like it's a set it and forget it situation. There's no real upkeep. The upkeep comes from the gains of the trust itself, right? So there's like you pay to set it up, but then you're not paying like upkeep for the trust every year. The trust is paying its own upkeep based on the return on investment from whatever dividends or coupon, payments or whatever the investment mechanism might be that it's making over time. So the corporate trustee is also only getting paid based on how well the trust performs, right? So the first couple of years of that trust, the trustee's not making much of anything, right? If the trustee is making 10% of the performance, not never the principal, right? So of the return on investment, and you started with, I don't know, let's say you started with $1,000 and you're getting 10% ROI. That's great ROI. That's not bad at all, right? You get 10%, but 10% on $1,000 is $100. So now the trustee might be getting 10%, of what it makes you. And maybe there's a performance bonus in there where they can get 20% if they do really, really well. But that 10% isn't really, really well. That's what you expected to make on the trust, right? And so 10% of the $100 is $10 for the entire year, right? So the trustee's not making a ton of money, off of those trusts as well, which is why your JP Morgans and them don't talk about it, right? Because you go to, Schwab or those guys, and they're going to say, "Oh, you want to trust with us? You need to have at least $300,000." Why? Because they're measuring what they're going to charge you yearly in upkeep, right? So the upkeep charge for them has to be X amount of dollars. So whether that's $50,000, whether it's $1,000,000, right? So different, different banks and different investment groups have different numbers. There are actually I think it is JP Morgan. There are groups that you have to have $50 million or they won't even do anything for you. And it's because they're making money as a trustee and they have a certain amount of money that's their minimum per client. Right. So when you're dealing with the big boys, so to speak, it might be a minimum that you're required to pay them $1 million a year or else they're not going to help you. Right. So that's why you see those particular trusts always being advertised, and that's why people think you need to be rich to have a trust, because the people who are managing the trust want a minimum amount of money, per client. But with the generational wealth trust, you can't do that because your target isn't wealthy client. A lot of the trust people, their targets are ultra high net worth individuals and super wealthy clients. So they can handle it that way. But if you're building generational wealth for people who ain't got no wealth and don't have no generational wealth, they're obviously not ultra high net worth individuals, right? So we've had clients that put away the lowest amount that they've put into the trust has been about $386. And the reason why it's a weird number is because it gets converted into local currency. So in local currency, it's a round number, but in the currency exchange, it's about $386. That's the lowest anybody's ever put in to a generational wealth trust, right? And the oldest one of those, which is about 12 years old now, with that very, very, very small number, is still looking at having about $35,000 in there off of that $300. So 12 years of compounding on $300, they got a few bucks in there, right? Now, had they started with $10,000, they'd be closer to, $800,000 now. So the bigger the amount you start with, the better the compounding works, right? Because what ends up happening is if you don't know the rule of 72, number one, go learn it. It's not a hard rule to learn, right? And then what it is that once you know the rule of 72 and you know your interest rate, you can do some division and divide by 72, and you'll know how many years it takes for your money to double, right? And so there are such see we have certain circumstances where people's money is doubling every 4 years, right? We have circumstances where one circumstance in particular where people's money is doubling every 3 years and like 9 months, right? So that's the way that you look at compounding and figure it out. Can you keep putting it? Yes, but if you do, it's a grantor trust. So if you were expecting it to be a non-grantor trust where you don't tell the government about the trust and legally, right? Like not just you're hiding it, but like you legally have no requirement to tell the government about the trust. And that's what you wanted to do, where you don't have to do IRS filings ever. Then you can't do the whole I'm going to keep paying into it thing, because as soon as you do that, it'll become a grantor trust. So all of the folks that want a non-grantor offshore trust for generational wealth, they have to come up with a lump sum, put that lump sum in, and walk away from it. They're not the trustee of it, or it's a grantor trust. They're not the enforcer, which is a different position within trust, or it's a grantor trust. It essentially has to be the trust is created, it's made for the kids or the next generation, it's doing its thing. The trustee is a corporate trustee, and the beneficiaries are those kids or whoever, and those beneficiaries have not gotten a distribution from it yet, and they're not going to get a distribution for 30 years or however long it's going to compound before it starts distributing. And then when it distributes, if those descendants are still U.S. citizens and the law hasn't changed, that's when they would be forced to make a tax declaration that this trust has now distributed X amount of funds to me, and every year on their tax returns would be the distributions from the trust. But yeah, and like I said, there are plenty of people who are like, no, I'll just, deal with the IRS. I want it to be grantor. I want to be the trustee even. I don't want the corporate trustee. You can do that. You can do that. Just got to stay up on your filings, but you can definitely take on that responsibility and make it a grantor trust and then pay into it, every month. And like that helps. Like the money grows tremendously faster if you are making weekly payments, monthly payments, bi-monthly payments. Typically people make the payments however they get paid, right? So folks who choose to make it a grantor trust and pay into it, they're typically paying something out of every paycheck, and then they just do their filings at the end of the year with the IRS. So yeah, the choice is definitely yours, and it's just whatever fits your lifestyle, whatever else you got going on. But for most people, I'd say about 80% of our generational wealth clients, it's a set it, forget it situation. Some people will choose the grantor path, and not make the filings, which is not legal, right? But there's a lot of grandparents. So you talk about generational wealth. There's a lot of old folks who are on their deathbed. Essentially, they do not care. They figure they're not going to be here by the time the IRS even catch up with them, and so they take calculated risks. That's another, I guess, bonus of being offshore, is that there's no requirement for the offshore operators to report anything to a foreign country. So you can take calculated risks if you want to. But we've had quite a few like grandparents like know that they don't have more than a year left. Doctor then already told them they got 6 months. And those are the ones that do like really solid, generational wealth. Like they'll do a $60,000 generational wealth trust, and they'll start with 60 grand. So if you start with 60 grand, and like, for example, the Kenyan infrastructure bond, right? I talk about it all the time. So if you haven't Googled it, go Google it. Number one, so you can actually see what it was hitting for. It's not open right now, so you can't buy it right now. But when it was open, it guaranteed, it was a government guarantee of 18.46% interest. That means every 3 years and 9 months, your money doubles. So you put $60,000 into that government bond, right? One of the safest investments you can possibly do is a government bond. Put $60,000 into that, and 4 years later, it's $120,000. 4 years after that, that $120,000 just doubled. So now you're looking at $240,000. 4 years after that, you got, you're at a half a million virtually. You know what I mean? 4 years after that, there's $1 million in there. In 12 years, you went from $60,000 to a million, right? So the more money you put in the beginning, the more you're going to get out of the back end, right? So but there's a lot of that. There's a lot of like grandparents. It's like, all right, we're about to go. You know what I mean? I've had people diagnosed with COPD, which is what my dad just died of. That come in like, look, I got COPD. They said I got 6 months. I got bone cancer. Was one of the guys came in, and which was crazy because the guy was he had a landscaping company. He was pushing the self-propelled, walking mower, but the big ones, like the ones they use for football fields. He slipped and fell down a hill, broke his leg, went to the hospital with the broken leg, and they found out that every bone in his body had bone cancer. He had no idea. He had no ill effects or nothing. When they told him to have bone cancer, he was going in 6 months. But he set up a generational wealth trust before he went. He liquidated the company and all of that stuff. And so he had a bit to drop in there. He dropped 6 figures in that trust. Right. And so, within a couple of years, that trust went from the 6 figures he dropped into it into millions, and the kids were still like 6, 8, and maybe 12 or whatever. Like they hadn't even gotten close to the point where they were going to start taking distributions from the trust, and it had already went from 6 figures to 7 figures. Right. And by the time they're ready, it's probably going to be 8, possibly even 9 figures, depending on what the markets do, right? So that's how compounding works. It's just math, right? This is very basic math. You look it up, and every mathematician and every investor and they're going to say the same thing. Sounds like magic. It's literally just math that no one teaches you about. But you're familiar with it because that's how your interest rates work. So the same way you swipe a card and then you don't pay it, and then by the end of the year you owe 5 times more than what you swiped, same thing. It's just compounding away from you instead of compounding for you. So it's the same math. So yeah, so that's it. The answer to your question is yes, you can, but then it's a grantor trust, and then the government's in your business, which again might make sense for you. For most people, though, they just do one giant payment and walk away. Hey, Eddie boy, what's going on, man? How are you? All right. Do all offshore trusts own companies? Most of them do. Most of them do. Not all of them, but most of them. Most of them do. It's an interesting feature, right? And it's something we didn't used to like push, right? But about 14 years ago, we did our first offshore trust, right? And that family has been so cool because we've gotten to see so much because of the 4-year progression and because they already had teenage children, right? So we got to see some things happen through that family and how their trust helped them. That we don't get to see from all of our clients, because we get a lot of clients that have no kids, right? They just got married and they set up a trust for their grandkids, and they have no kids yet, which is a beautiful thing. It's incredibly smart. But we also don't get to see like what's going to happen in that family because it's not there yet, right? But luckily, when it comes to the Buchanans, their trust, we've seen a whole bunch of stuff happen with them. So their trust does own a company, and the company is profitable. And so the kids of all the descendants have the right to intern at that company, and then work at that company like forever, right? And one of the things that they did, and in their mind when they did it, they were trying to like teach the discipline and responsibility and like don't live off of like the family company, like go on your way, blah 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 blah, right? Like that type of stuff. But you know, the plans of mice and men, right? So in the trust deed, it says that all of the heirs and all of the beneficiaries will receive minimum wage, right? Whatever minimum wage is, that's what they're getting. And they thought that that was going to like spur them into like doing something else. Like, all right, go here, intern for minimum wage, get your work experience, and then go elsewhere, right? Build your own stuff, blah 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 blah. Okay, so but the company's doing great, and there's corporate housing, and there are corporate vehicles and all of that stuff, and they weren't as tight with like the vehicle stuff and all of that and the housing stuff, but there's like a percentage cap, right? But the company's doing great, which means the percentage is higher. So the oldest kid got to the point where like he can get the corporate housing, and he has a really nice house with the corporate housing. And then he figured out that if he leases cars, he could get really nice cars, but stay within the budget essentially, right? So he drives like Rolls Royces and stuff like that, whatever. So somebody noticed, and somebody thought that, hey, that's a pretty nice lifestyle. They got married. Within a year, there was a baby in play. And then within a year from that, there was I'm taking half of this, I'm divorcing you, blah, 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 all of that. So what they found out completely by mistake, they didn't plan for this, right? But just because they had the protection in place, what they ended up finding out was that by the end of that process, that young lady found out that her child support was going to be $50 a month because he had been making minimum wage since he was 16 years old. Like since he was an intern at this place. First of all, when he was an intern, and working at 16, it was part-time, right? So he had been making minimum wage for years before he met her, right? And the entire time that they were married, the house didn't belong to him. The car didn't belong to him. So she found out that she was not getting half of anything, and her child support was $50 a month, right? And according to the Buchanans, she literally handed him the baby, went and found another guy and told that guy she'd never had any children in her life, and started the scam all over again, right? So that worked out really well for them, and then they changed their mentality. They were like, oh, wait a minute. Everyone works for the company now until they die. You make minimum wage on paper now until you die. And the corporate perks will handle everything else, right? So they change the way that they handle that process. But when you have really good protection in place, there are just ancillary benefits that pop up that you weren't expecting to pop up, right? Same thing with like the bloodline clauses. Most of those trusts have a bloodline clause that the beneficiary has to be of a certain bloodline. It's not necessarily a paternity clause, because with a lot of folks, the bloodline clause is both the matriarch and the patriarch, right? So you might be doing something like, all right, well, maybe we won't make it, right? Maybe our marriage won't last, but this thing we're building right now will benefit our children. So my new wife and your new husband, make a new trust for them. That ain't got nothing to do with this. This will only benefit people that are from the both of us, right? And so then you have a bloodline clause, and then all the children get tested, and they get tested for both parents. Well, again, ancillary benefits. We had a client that went into emergency C-section. Baby was rushed to the NICU. Da 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 da. Baby comes back. When baby comes back and everything is okay and the emergency has passed, hey, I have this trust and I have a legal obligation to do a DNA test, not a paternity test, that would have screwed them, but a DNA test, da 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 da. Baby comes back, it ain't related to none of you. It seems that during the emergency, another woman had an emergency C-section as well, and during the emergency, we swapped those babies. You're both still in the hospital. We've corrected the mistake. Right? So without that clause in the trust, she'd have never known. She'd have took the wrong baby home, and probably wouldn't know to this day, because why would you DNA test the baby, right? Right? So there are these things that get put into place that end up having these benefits that you never thought you were going to get out of the rules of the family, essentially, right? Out of the rules of the trust. So we see a lot of that all the time. And that's why having a professional with a bit of experience kind of matters, because they know what may come up. So while you're going through the process of drafting the trust deed, they can say things like, we had a client that had a very similar kind of spendthrift provision in here, where they were getting X amount of dollars, per month or per year, but they fell into addiction, and there was no provision in the trust to stop giving them that money. So the trustee was forced by law to feed their addiction and just keep feeding them money until they OD'd and unalive themselves. So maybe we should put a provision in here, and maybe we should make sure that a trustee can't abuse it. So maybe we should make sure that a doctor's opinion is necessary and a second opinion is necessary. And make sure that they go through rehab, and then we have a psychologist's opinion as to whether or not the rehab took, or whether it didn't, and maybe there should be updates and things of this nature. So if you've not been through it, and there's nobody who has addiction in your family, so you're not even considering it, then why would you think of that, and why would you put that in into your trust deed, if there's no professional there to be like, hey, listen, we've seen this before, maybe you should do it this way, right? So that's the major reason for the professionals. We had somebody, man, their situation was so horrible. We had somebody who started with domestic trust. A lot of our clients already come to us and they have like a domestic trust. And so they started with domestic trust, and their plan was the domestic trust would end up paying the kids' college tuition. And so they had a bunch of like multi-family apartment building type of things, like little 4 units, like nothing crazy. And they were owned by a company that was owned by the trust, and the trust managed everything, and blah 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 blah. So the problem is they did the trust themselves, and so somebody got into hard times and ended up not paying. And then after a month of not paying or two, they were like, oh well, we gotta evict this person, and whatever. And then they found out that there were no eviction powers in the trust, and that the bylaws of the company deferred to the trust. So the trustee couldn't evict anybody. So those people were stuck, and then the bad tenant told all the rest of the tenants, "Oh, you can't get evicted here. You don't have to pay." So everyone stopped paying. Took 2 years to get a judge. It's an irrevocable trust. So it took 2 years to get a judge to revoke it, because it's not supposed to be revoked. Once the trust revoked, all the properties slammed back into the ownership of the grantors, which were the parents in this case. So as soon as the trust was revoked, okay, that's great. Now we can evict. But all of a sudden, the IRS just thinks that we made $20 million, right? Because 6, 7 properties just slammed back into our name. So now the IRS thinks we just had a windfall and we need to pay taxes on that. So now we got an IRS battle. Now we got another 6-month battle to evict everybody. So what do you think happened to the college money for the kids, right? That one little mistake that happened because they didn't have any experience cost them all the money they'd saved for their kids' education, right? So it's not, irrevocable trusts aren't things that you play with and think that you can go to ChatGPT and figure out. Revocable trust, maybe, because a revocable trust you can just get rid of. It's not a problem. It can be revoked. It's revocable. Irrevocable trust, not so much, right? So make sure that you're dealing with the professional that's going to help you out on that, and make sure that you get everything you need on that. No, actually, no, it's in the opposite order. So you want the family constitution to come first. I can see you. I can see you follow me. You've been listening. You want the family constitution to come first, and the artifacts of the family constitution come first, and then the family constitution will inform the trust deed, and it can inform multiple trust deeds, right? Because the family constitution can govern the family at large, and then different branches of the family might have their own trust. So the family constitution might cover everybody, all the cousins, all the Smiths, are part of the Smith family constitution, right? But Albert Smith might have the AS lineage of the Smith family, and he has his own trust for his descendants, and then Marcus Smith might have the MS lineage of the Smith family, and he has his own trust for his descendants. But the family constitution will typically inform what the trust deed looks like, right? Does the Constitution grant you? Oh, coat of arms? You mean like coat of arms? No, the Constitution doesn't grant you a coat of arms. The coat of arms comes from a heraldic authority. That's a great question. Coat of arms comes from a heraldic authority. Here's the issue. All of this stuff is psychological, right? So having the family constitution, having the traditions built into the family, having all of those things gives psychological confidence to the family, right? Having the morals and the values and all that stuff in the family constitution keeps the descendants from asking esoteric questions, which are time wasters in life, right? So if you're stuck in an esoteric loop, why am I here? What's the purpose of life? Why was I born? That you're wasting time in life, right? Those things can be handled by family explaining exactly what this family is here for, what we do, and why, right? The coat of arms is an artifact of the family. And so the issue becomes if any of those things are faked, right? Like if you just design a pretty little picture and call it your coat of arms, right? Or something like that, then what happens is when the esoteric questions start, why are we here? What is this about? Oh, well, this is the family coat of arms. Oh, okay. And they start looking into it. What's a coat of arms? How does it work? Oh, it's a heraldic authority that has to issue the coat of arms. Okay, where's our heraldic authority? Oh, we don't have one. Oh, so it's fake. Now you actually damage the confidence of the family, right? So the coat of arms is issued by a heraldic authority, not necessarily created by the family constitution, right? So you can have a motto. You can decide that, like you have a family logo or something like that, and then later, that logo might become a coat of arms. But coats of arms are issued by heraldic authorities, and they're described by heraldic language. So if you can't even speak heraldic language, you got a problem with the whole coat of arms thing. I know a lot of people think they're cool and stuff, but it's deeper than that, right? So everything that you create for your family that's going to become a family artifact has to be real. Or when your family finds out that it's not real or it's some flim flam thing that you did, you're going to steal confidence from your family, which is the opposite of what you want to do. You want every time your family member and your descendant does research into who we are, they come back with verifiable sources and authorities that have issued, proclamations and so on and so forth. And so every time they do any kind of research into the family, it boosts their confidence, right? That's what the family structure is supposed to do. Great question, though. I'm happy you asked that. You guys are asking killer questions today. Yes. My coat of arms was granted by the Kenyan College of Arms, right? So some heraldic authorities are government, some aren't in governments that don't have a heraldic section. The United States doesn't have a heraldic section, so their heraldic authorities are typically private. Um, but our grant of arms was granted by the College of Arms of the Republic of Kenya. And then so there's something called a blazon. The blazon is the heraldic language that describes the coat of arms, right? So that has to be appropriate as well. And the college won't grant your arms if there's no blazon that describes it. And so then the elements in the coat of arms would then tell a story about the history and the legacy and even the origins of your family. And then if you have a coat of arms, you would automatically have a shield because it's part of the coat of arms, and you would automatically have a crest because the crest is actually just an area in the coat of arms. So all of those things come together. It might have a motto. It might. Some coat of arms have a motto at the bottom. Our coat of arms does. Not all coat of arms do. So you may have a motto that's on the coat of arms. You may not. Um, Ask about family constitutions. What about them? So they're documents that guide future generations and even the current generation in how to build a cohesive, strong family moving forward. That's what that's what the family constitution does. So the most important part of the family constitution is typically the what is it called? The conflict resolution clause. That's typically the most important part, right? There should be accounting clauses and accounting articles of the Constitution. That's pretty high up there in importance too. But the most important part that from our experience is the conflict resolution. If you don't have a conflict resolution article, it's going to be bad. It's going to be bad because conflicts are going to arise. It's guaranteed. You're not going to have a family that doesn't have conflicts. So the faster you get past the conflicts, the faster you get back to family business. And family businesses are unstoppable. Individuals are easy to beat, no matter how skilled they are. Easy to take out an individual. But family business, you're not doing nothing with that. Well, yeah, it's family conflicts that break up those businesses. They destroy themselves. But if you're competing against a family, you're screwed. Unless you yourself are a family, you know. But it's just they're just way more powerful than any individual. But they typically defeat themselves. Same thing as like illegal families, right? The reason why like Casa Nostra and all of that stuff and the mafia were so powerful is because they structured it as a family, right? And then what happened? There was somebody inside the family that would turn or whatever, or they thought they got treated wrong and they, go talk to the authorities or whatever, and that's how most of that got shut down. The ones that didn't get shut down that way, it was typically financial, right? Like Al Capone and the IRS taking him down when the police never could. So it goes back to those two things that I just said are the most important. Even when it's not illicit, it still boils down to conflict resolution within the family and your budgeting, your financing, resolutions and what your protocols are on that front. If your money is set and you can weather any storm together, you're unbeatable, right? There's a whole lot more that you want to put in there, but those are definitely the top two most important articles in any family constitution that we've ever seen. Does that answer your question on the family constitutions? Okay, good, good. Any other questions? If not, I'll take it back to the offshore entities. Okay. So we like to use Seychelles as our example just because the tax rate is 0%. So when we're setting up the offshore entities, do we always set up a trust right away? Not necessarily. Not necessarily. If the entity is already cash flowing, to a certain extent, right? And if the entity doesn't exist, how can it cash flow? So it means that you're already in the business and the business is already cash flowing. And maybe that entity is either going to be a holding company, some sort of management company, that's going to end up owning the company that you already have that's cash flowing, right? So then you can kind of say like, all right, this thing is already making money, right? So it ends up being a bit of a merger or acquisition. of this new structure that's going to own the old structure, right? So that's what organizations like McDonald's and all that, do, right? McDonald's was obviously first an American company, but it has offshore, Swedish branches and offshore, Abu Dhabi and all this stuff. And they pay taxes in those locations at lower tax rates so they can save taxes in America, blah, 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 right? So when they created those structures, they were already cash flowing, even though the structure didn't exist yet, right? Because that structure was going to own so much of the original company or so much of the supply chain of the original company, so on and so forth. So what are the pitfalls? What are the things that no one talks about, that might be a pitfall in creating these structures? The number one thing is to make sure that your deals are arm's length deals, right? Make sure that your deals are arm's length deals, okay? If you've been following for a while, you might remember Miss May, right? Miss May, rest in peace, was our first client that actually did manufacturing out here, which is what we really started to get people out here doing. Unfortunately, it's like pulling teeth, so it's rare that it happens. But when we first started, we noticed that black-owned businesses only owned 1.86% of the land in the United States, and we only owned 0.86% of the manufacturing in the United States, according to the census data. And so we were like, well, this is bullshit, right? And it's part of why we're in the situation that we're in. So obviously, to open up a factory in the United States, you need millions. So we were like, all right, how about we help people open up production facilities in places like Kenya where they can do it for 40,000, and then follow Chinatown's example, get those goods back to Harlem and Philly and Atlanta, and then have our own supply chain going and blah 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 blah. Well, Miss May was from Detroit. Her granddaughter was unalived by police officers in Detroit. At the time, the police chief was like, nope, that's ridiculous. It's completely unjustifiable. Wanted to fire the officer, but the officer paid their dues. And so the union protected the officer. Now, Miss May owned the shop where she did corporate gifts, T-shirts, the Employee of the Month award, all of that. She used to get her shirts from a certain shirt company. And she found out that shirt company was the number one donor to the police union. So her black-owned business had to pay this other business that did not have the best interests of the black community at heart before she even made a dollar, because she had to get her supplies from that business. And she found out that business was literally keeping the murderer of her granddaughter safe and free. So she was the first one that was actually, incentivized to start making her own T-shirts and all of that stuff, right? So she did that, set up a company out here, making the T-shirts, sending them back to herself. And what she did was she charged herself the same money that the old company was charging, okay? And that kept her at the same profit level. Like, she didn't make new profits by opening up the company on the U.S. side, right? So the IRS came. We don't think this is an arm's length deal because you own both companies and you're selling it to yourself in such a way that's allowing you to like break even or make a smaller profit than you would otherwise make. So here's what happened. The enrolled agent brought all of the invoices from those white-owned T-shirt manufacturers in the United States and showed that it's the exact same amount. And then they got a little spicy. And then they said, so here's what we're going to do. We're either going to go public, and you as the IRS are going to declare that these white-owned companies were overcharging the black distributors, or you're going to acknowledge that it's an arm's length deal and she's charging herself the same thing that she would be charged if she was doing business with a company that she didn't own, which is essentially the rule. And the IRS went away, right? And that was what was happening. The white companies were overcharging her and making it so that she really couldn't compete against any of their white distributors. And so the IRS, once she started doing it to herself, decided now was the time to show up and say, "Oh, wait a minute, you could be making more profit and you could be paying more taxes, but you're not. So we don't think it's an arm's length deal." So when they saw that there was years and years and years of the exact same prices being paid, and they never popped up then and said, "Oh, these prices, you could be making more profit," right? So they went away, right? But that's important. It's important that you're not manipulating things so that you break even in the U.S. and don't have to pay any taxes in the U.S. and you're making all your taxes, in Kenya at the manufacturing plant. It has to be an arm's length deal, right? So it has to be a deal that looks just like a deal would look if you were doing business with somebody that you didn't own, right? So that's super important. Nobody talks about it because most of the people who talk about this stuff don't actually know what they're talking about, right? So there's always rules to the game, right? There are none of these secret things, and these are what the rich people do with or else all the rich people be doing it, right? There'd be one thing that the Elon Musks of the world could do and never pay taxes again. That doesn't work that way, right? So you have to have the proper structure. It has to be reasonable. You're going to pay taxes. You just want to make sure that you only pay what you're required to pay, right? So you pay the minimum legal amount of taxes. But that's how it really works. So there's your pitfall, to make sure that you always have those offshore affiliate companies charging you what a non-affiliated company would charge you. It has to be an arm's length deal. If you need better understanding on what an arm's length deal is, go to irs.gov, put it in the search. irs.gov, put it in the search bar, arm's length deal, and let the IRS give you their definition of it and go from there. Go to your enrolled agent, ask them if they know anything about arm's length deals. Make sure that you're dealing with tax professionals that understand overseas nuances when it comes to tax, right? So arm's length deal is something that they definitely should know. They should understand supply chain infrastructure as well. So if they this is not you've passed H&R Block. This is not an H&R Block situation, right? You need tax professionals that understand international tax complexities, right? So that's what you want on the payroll once you step out, right? So you can typically get away with a bookkeeper in all jurisdictions at first, and then tie it together with a tax strategist who understands international taxes. Now, if you can't find a tax strategist who understands international taxes, then you can kind of work with someone who's a tax professional who wants to learn with the understanding of if you're learning on my dime, I'm not paying full price, right? So if this is a scholarship and I'm about to, pay your way through the University of Learning International Tax Specialization, which you're then going to turn around and make more money with, then that has to be reflected in our contract. But we've done that once or two times ourselves, and we've definitely had clients who've done that, who just couldn't find the proper specialist. Or couldn't find a proper specialist within their community. There's a lot of people who only do business within their community. And so they had to make a specialist in their community. All right. That you understand what an arm's length deal is. You all get that. It's the number one pitfall. There are others, but that's the number one. So that's why I touched on that more than the rest. But the number one pitfall is not doing arm's length deals, which can turn into all kinds of things. It can turn into tax evasion. It can turn into embezzlement. It depends on how it's done, but it can turn into all kinds of funky things because it's a manipulation. It's not real. And I've told you guys plenty of times, legitimacy is the key to everything. It has to be. They have to be legitimate structures. They can't be fake. They can't be on paper. They can't be some loophole. It has to be a legitimate structure. You need to be what the code says you need to be. So if the code says, all right, you don't have to pay taxes for 7 years if you're X, Y, and Z, you need to be X, Y, and Z. You can't fake it, right? You fake it, then you'll end up in problems. Because there are signs, especially in the digital age. There are ways to look and see, like, all right, well, if this was legitimate, yeah, fine, they got this tax side of it down, but what about the capital gain side? What about the import export side? So there's gonna be breadcrumbs that show that there's something that you're not doing right, and then that's how audits happen. And then depending on what the audit reveals, that's how criminal charges happen, right? Not everything's a lawsuit. Some things send you to jail. So yeah, definitely make sure that you are whatever you need to be, or you become whatever you need to be. Most people aren't. Even like the big companies, they typically don't like check all the boxes, right away. Whatever it is that they're trying to do, they find out what the requirement is and they become that. So that's what you have to do as well. All right. We used to do a lot of that with our sam.gov clients. There used to be a lot of clients that they would go through some sam.gov to turn whatever job they did into a job that they owned. It would be a business, but it would be like a solopreneur type of thing where they're still doing all the work. So it'd be like owning a job more than owning a business. But that would be how they financed their relocations, right? We don't do it right now because of the current administration. It doesn't make sense to do it right now. Maybe next administration will start it back up again. But we used to register people through SAM, and then we had our own team that would write government contract proposals for them. And then they would get the government contract proposal and whatever it is they were already doing, and just do that thing, and then based on the profit that they made from doing it, once or twice, be able to hire some people, and now it becomes like a real company, right? And then you can leave. You're the CEO of the company. It's the company that's doing the government contract, not the individual, right? You're the CEO of the company. You can go live on the beach in Kenya if you want, and the company continues doing, the government contracts. You incentivize, the managers, that they get a percentage of they profit share. They get a percentage of the profits, and so the more contracts they get, the more profits there are. The more profits there are, the more money they make. So just set up the right incentives, and you're good to go. So that used to be like one of our biggest programs until like Doge cut all the government contracts. So they're definitely within that framework. You had to become whatever the government was asking for so that you could qualify for that contract. But very rarely could you fake it. Very, very rarely could you fake it. Now, what you could do is you could subcontract it. You could do what's called prime contracting. So you could come in and not be that, but sub it to someone who was that, right? But you're still ultimately responsible for that contract, even as a sub, even as a prime contractor. So if you didn't vet them properly and they're not what they're supposed to be, and you said they were, that could become a problem. Or if they jack up the contract and you don't have a backup, you're ultimately responsible for that. So pros and cons to everything. There's no magic bullet. All right. Any questions on any of that? So we're good on that. Everybody good on that? All right. It's been an hour and a half today, not as long as I normally stay on, but as a few of you have pointed out, my father's funeral was yesterday. I am a little distracted, so I guess I'm going to call it. Unless you guys have any other questions, I think that's it. I think that'll do it for today. If you're writing a question, just type one, or just type whatever you wrote so I know a question's coming and I'll wait for you to finish it. And if not, then I'll wrap it up. Oh, hey, what's going on, man? Yeah, thanks for that. Thanks for that. Yeah, you can't see all the comments because you're on a different live stream. There's three of you guys here. Let me show you guys each other. There's three of you guys. so so some folks are on Facebook, some folks are on YouTube, some folks are on TikTok. I'm not just talking to myself. Ah, thanks, Eddie. Thanks. I appreciate that. All right, guys. I will most likely be back tomorrow. I believe in consistency. So I should be back tomorrow. I'm only not here on like holidays and emergencies. All right, talk to you guys later. Thanks for hanging out with me. I don't know what we're gonna talk about tomorrow. Maybe tomorrow will be like a free Q&A session or something like that. So if it's going to be a Q&A session and you come on Facebook or you show up on YouTube, feel free to type whatever you want and ask your questions. But if you want to like come up on the live stream and verbally ask anything, then come find us on TikTok where I can like bring you up into the box as they call it. So we'll do that tomorrow. All right, talk to you guys. See ya. Peace, Joyce. Ah, thank you, brother.